If we think about it, we have just a few options of movement at our disposal. We can move one direction or the other. For instance, the hips or the pelvis can either tilt forward or tilt back. There's no other direction that can tilt forward or back. The same holds true for sideways action. We can either go to the right or to the left. We don't have a third direction. So when we look at the simplistic motions of the body purely in one-dimensional space, we're only going to find really a couple of options at our disposal. And over the course of 2 million years, the way the body has been able to move against gravity in this upright posture has really become very efficient. And therefore, we've found a way to relate one joint motion with another. And that's just been hardwired over the course of generation after generation of learning just how we go from one foot to the next. So when we break up the gait cycle, the moment the heel strikes the ground to the very next moment the same heel strikes the ground, we're going to find a certain pattern of motion. And it's the most basic way in which we move from point A to point B. So if we were to, again, think of one-dimensional space, we'll start with the sagittal plane, which is that forward and backward action. We'll find a forward tilt or a backward posterior tilt, or maybe we'll see extension or flexion. Those are our only options. So in regards to the type of shape the body can take up, we're really seeing only a couple of shapes. For instance, when the pelvis tilts forward, in order for me to stay upright on top of both feet, the rest of my body has to kind of somehow figure out an organized movement around that. So when the pelvis tilts forward, the rib cage will begin tilting backward. And that would be very strange if my head didn't tilt forward to keep me level. So we have these cog-like actions, these cog wheels that you would find in machinery. When one clockwise motion occurs, the wheel beside it creates a counterclockwise action. So the first body shape is tilted anterior pelvis, a posteriorly tilted rib cage, and an anteriorly tilted skull. You can get a sense of how that extends the spine. We could also look at it in terms of muscular action, like the front of the pelvis will begin shortening the muscles in front, while the muscles on the back side of the hips and pelvis begin to lengthen out. So that's the first shape. Now the second shape would be just the opposite direction. Instead of an anteriorly tilted pelvis, the pelvis would begin posteriorly tilting. And in order for me to keep my weight over my feet as my pelvis posteriorly tilts, I need to bring my rib cage in a forward or anterior tilt, which means that the head would have to posteriorly tilt to stay on top of this. Now you might often see some elderly individuals who have fixated themselves into that position. It's not uncommon. We have a tendency to kind of gravitate toward our imbalances if they don't get corrected or reintroduced to something more efficient. So the second motion is posterior tilt, anteriorly tilted rib cage, and posteriorly tilted skull. You might find that you're gravitating gently in one of these two directions, either anteriorly tilted pelvis, stretched out abdominals, compressed lower back, rib cage lifted up, or we might be gravitating toward the opposite direction. Do you resemble to some subtle or not so subtle degree either of those two shapes? Now when it comes to the frontal plane, the sideways action, the pelvis can glide laterally without necessarily tilting on its axis. So it just glides to one side. When that happens, if I'm trying to keep my weight equally over both feet, I need to glide my rib cage to the opposite side. And then the head has to find a balance point between. So the pelvis and hips will travel in one direction, rib cage in the opposite, and the head kind of corrects that action by driving the same direction as the pelvis itself. That's the third body shape. The fourth body shape is simply the opposite direction. Pelvis traveling in one direction, rib cage in the opposite, head counteracting the ribs position. So do we see this in nature? Well, in terms of human nature, you might see it in regards to a scoliotic shift. Now these positions all should occur at some point in the gait cycle. These movements are not distortions to our posture, but they're ways in which we access motion to go from one leg to the next. It's only that some people become more fixated in one of these shapes, or a combination of those shapes, over the balanced position. Now, the other way the pelvis can move laterally is by tilting on one side or the other, a lateral tilt, or what you might call a hike and a drop. So if we were to bend into one knee, you would see that one pelvis side is higher than the other side. That would send me off in this direction unless I tried to bring myself more balanced over both feet by tilting my rib cage in the opposite direction. And then I would have to tilt my head opposite of that. So again, we're starting to see these cogwheel actions. When the pelvis drops on one side, ribs counteract that, and the head counteracts that. So shapes number 5 and 6 will have a hiking pelvis with a laterally flexed or side-bending rib cage toward the high pelvic side. And the head itself will try to maintain a balanced position to kind of lock on the horizon by going the opposite direction. Number 6 is just the opposite. The other side of the pelvis is higher than the counterpart. The rib cage laterally flexes toward that side, and the head counteracts that by flexing away. So what you're noticing is that the pelvis and the head are actually both doing the same motion in the same direction, and the ribs are opposing that. Now, the same can happen in the transverse plane, which is all about rotation. So if the pelvis were to rotate off to the left, the rib cage would rotate to the right. And then the head would have to gently rotate left to maintain its central point. So we have pelvis rotating one direction, ribs another, and the head counteracting the ribs by rotating the same direction of the pelvis. So there's shapes 7 and 8, rotating to the left, rotating right up above, and rotating left above that, or vice versa. Now, these 8 body shapes may create combinations. There may not be one person that's purely one or the other. You might notice when you do your posture assessment and movement screening that you're a combination of these. But there's going to be some tendency, some trend in which you're most likely subtly or not so subtly traveling. And this is going to give you a better indication of what the muscles of your body may need in regards to balancing out the tension and building strength and endurance and coordination. If I am rotated in one direction, that means one hip is now internally rotating while the other one's externally rotating. If I've got one hip or a pelvis that's higher than the other, there's more contraction or closer toward the midline of one leg than the opposite. We call that adduction versus abduction. And in terms of the anterior posterior tilt, when we tilt forward, we'll see certain muscles have to shorten up, such as the lower back or the hip flexors, areas that are often overworked and shortened, and we've been told we've got to really open those up. While meanwhile, other muscles become stretched out and don't have the capacity to shorten back to a normal resting length, such as the abdominal wall, the gluteals, which are often 2 areas we've been told you really need to strengthen. So what we're going to try and do is get a better sense out of all of these 8 body shapes, where do you line up? Is it one of the sagittal plane, either a forward or a posterior tilt to the pelvis? Which way is your rib cage going? Do you feel that you have a little bit of shift laterally over one leg, or do you feel like you kind of stand with attitude? And if you were to look down, do you notice that one pelvis is slightly forward, one hip is slightly forward compared to the other? We only have one pelvis, so we're really talking about the hips. Or is one shoulder a little bit more in front of the body than the other? Just get a general sense of what is the shape that your body's creating, because then we can get a better sense of what you really need in regards to strength and conditioning.